So I'm very pleased to be following on after Deborah because a lot of what she said introduces the subject that I want to share on today. I would say that I'm not an expert in the education sector, although I have been a governor of two schools in my time, the schools at which my children were attending at the time. So I do have some actual experience of the sector. But what I want to share is some ideas which are generally applicable, and you can do the work of applying it to your particular sector. And if you find anything difficult or you're unsure, then we can tackle that in the questions afterwards. So I hope that's okay with you. And what I want to talk about here, Deborah mentioned quite a lot about what risk culture is and why it's important. So now I want to try and give you some practical guidelines in how you assess where your school's risk culture currently is. And once you know where it is, if that's not where you want to be, how can you improve that? So culture is really important for a number of reasons. It's a CSF. You might have heard this term CSF. Usually we think it means a critical success factor, which means that if we have it, then success is possible. But I think CSF can also mean a critical source of failure in that if culture is absent or is negative, actually it makes success impossible. So either way, in success or failure, culture is really important. And the reason is because it sets the context for everything else in terms of what we do in understanding, identifying, managing, taking or avoiding risks for our organization, for our school, for our pupils, and for our parents and other stakeholders. So it's really, really important. Culture matters. And I'm going to be drawing on some things that Deborah quoted from in her presentation, some work that was done by the Institute of Risk Management, IRM, back in 2012. It's a long time ago, but this was thought leadership work, which is actually still current. And there's two documents here. The document on the right, Guidance for Boards, I think has been circulated to you. If you want to get the copy, a copy directly online, the link is on the screen here, or you can click on the QR code. And that's about a 20-page booklet aimed at the high level guidance for boards on understanding and improving risk culture. The other document, Resources for Practitioners, is about 150 pages. It's quite thick. It's quite detailed, gives you models and frameworks. Some of the things, again, that Deborah shared in her presentation come from this practitioner's document. Both of these are free to download from the website that's here for the IRM. And I was part of the team that put these documents together, and you'll see some of my work in there and also in the slides that follow. So this is a kind of source, but I've also, like Deborah, taken the opportunity to apply some of these things in practice with organizations, large and small, in different sectors and in different countries, and actually put into practice these ideas because risk culture really matters. So I'm going to just step back a little bit and go back into some of the material that Deborah shared as a starting point. I'll move quite quickly and then get into the things which are more practical guidance for how you can actually assess and improve or develop your school's risk culture. So what I want to offer you is a working theory, if you like, a definition. Culture, you'll find defined in the document, and Deborah said this, culture is values, belief, knowledge, and understanding. It's these things which are shared by a group of people with a common purpose. And risk culture is values, belief, knowledge, and understanding about risk, shared by a group of people with a common purpose. These definitions come from that Institute of Risk Management document and were actually something that I developed and contributed a little before that. So to assess and improve culture, which is what we're talking about today, we need to know what a good culture or a good risk culture looks like, to know where it comes from and how we can change it. So what is a good risk culture? Again, these are some things that Deborah mentioned. I'll just move through these fairly quickly, but a good risk culture is one that helps you manage risk effectively. It's one that engages everybody across the whole school, the whole organization, proactively in understanding and managing risk, not leaving it as something technical for the specialists, but knowing this is something we all need to be involved in. It helps you take the right risks safely, appropriate risk taking in pursuit of your objectives, and helps you identify and treat risks as you go. So a risk culture provides that context or setting to do these things well. And if, because it's a CSF, a critical success factor, means if you have these things right, it will make risk management easy and efficient and effective. But if you have a poor risk culture, then it'll make it hard for you to understand and manage the risks in an effective way. In the risk document, we find a set of indicators, which again, Deborah mentioned, tone from the top, commitment to ethical principles, and so on. I don't need to repeat through these. But these are things that you can use as a checklist. Do we have these things? And she recommended that we would go after the presentation, after today's event, and go back with our own school or our own organization and say, are these things true of us? And if not, what is that telling us about our risk culture? But risk culture is actually something that can be assessed, although it is difficult, because risk culture is about values, beliefs, knowledge, and understanding. And the problem with these things is that they're all internal. How can you see somebody's values or a school's values? How can you test understanding about risk or about anything else? How do we modify it if we can't see it and measure it and monitor it? All these things are hidden inside people and inside groups and inside organizations. So how are we going to assess it if we can't see it and get our hands on it? There are a number of cultural diagnostic tools available. The IRM risk culture aspects framework that Deborah mentioned is one of them. But most of these are looking at behaviors. They're not measuring values and beliefs. They're external things. You can see how many times we look at understanding and reviewing our risks. How well do we action our risk register items? How often do we update our understanding of risk? These things are behaviors. They're not values or beliefs. So we can measure behavior, but that's not measuring culture. So what we want to have is something that will get underneath the skin of what we believe, what we value, what we think is true about risk. Our values, beliefs, knowledge and understanding shared by the people in our school, whether it be the board, whether it be our senior leadership team or the staff or the parents or the children. All of these different groups have an understanding about risk, and this determines what our risk culture is. So I'd like to offer you a very simple tool to help you understand how you think about risk, what your values and beliefs, knowledge and understanding might be. And I call this tool the risk mindset, which describes 6 core values and beliefs about risk, 6 core values which shape our risk culture. So this is a tool that you can use once we understand what the 6 things are to help you understand how you think, what you believe about risk. And the 6 things in the risk mindset are these. Risk is natural, risk is manageable, risk matters, not all risk is bad, my risk is my responsibility, and being proactive is essential. All of these are values, all of these are beliefs, all of these are things that we understand about risk or not. And these 6 items represent a mature or a positive risk mindset, which will promote the types of behaviors that we were talking about as effective, resulting from an effective risk culture. So I'd like to quickly step through these 6 things and describe them to you in a little bit more detail. And then we can use them as a test, as a kind of scorecard, if you like, to assess the risk culture of our organization. So let's start with the idea that risk is natural. You've heard the VUCA acronym, I'm sure: volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And we all know that these things are everywhere. They're part of our environment. They're part of the life that we live, the world that we live in. Everywhere we look, we find questions raining down on us. The world is uncertain, and it's quite natural that it should be. Why should we know everything that there is to know? Why should we understand everything that could be understood about the future? It's quite natural to recognize that actually we don't know everything and we can't know everything. And uncertainty is part of the picture. Volatility, where things are constantly changing. Complexity, where things can't be understood in terms of a few simple rules. And ambiguity, where you look at one thing and it turns out to be something else. These things are quite natural. They're features of the environment that we live in. So risk is natural, is an important value that we need to understand and believe, because it will affect our behavior and how we actually identify and manage risk going forward. Secondly, risk is manageable. This is a value. Some people think that we are victims of risk. Risk just kind of happens to me and I can't do anything about it. It's just, poor me, this risk just came from nowhere and it kind of exploded in my face. And what could I do? I can't be expected to know everything about the future. And we have a kind of victim mentality. It's not true that risk is unmanageable. You can always do something about any risk. We need to move from the belief that we're victims of risk to being victorious over risk, to saying, yeah, I can do something. And we'll talk about what some of those manageable things might be. Even things that appear to be uncontrollable, you can always do something. You can withdraw, you can protect yourself. You can decide not to do certain things where you would be exposed to an uncontrollable risk. You can always do something. So risk is manageable is a key value, a key belief. If you think risk is unmanageable, then it will affect your behavior in a certain way. But to know that risk is always manageable, there's always something you can do, is a key value that will determine your culture and behavior. The third part of the risk mindset is to say risk matters. It's not just some irrelevant technicality, some thing you have to do for compliance, some meeting that the Risk and Audit Committee will have and produce a risk register and a report that you have to read and decide on. It's really important. Here's an important fact about risk. All risks are uncertain, but not all uncertainties are risks. So if you think about it, there are an infinite number of uncertainties in our world, but we don't care about all of them. You don't really care about the state of the energy infrastructure here in Africa. Actually, we do care about it now, because this evening for this presentation, it actually matters whether that energy infrastructure is going to hold up. But generally, for your school, you don't care about energy in South Africa. It's irrelevant to you. It's an uncertainty, but it doesn't matter. So risk and uncertainty are not the same thing. Risk is not the same as uncertainty. So how do we know which uncertainties are risks? Risks are the uncertainties that matter. There are some uncertainties we don't care about. Is it going to rain in Kazakhstan next week? Who cares? We don't know, but it doesn't matter. It's not a risk that we need to understand, identify, or manage or do anything about. But is it going to rain when my school has an outing and when we are going to be doing some things outdoors and we need to have fair weather? Then it matters. So risk is uncertainty that matters. Most of the uncertainties don't matter. How do we know which ones matter? They matter because they can affect our objectives, the things that we're trying to achieve. Any uncertainty that could affect what we're trying to do is an uncertainty that matters. It's a risk that we need to identify, understand, and do something about so that we can achieve our objectives in the most effective way. So understanding that risk is not irrelevant, risk is not a technicality that someone else can take care of. Risk is really important because it's linked to our objectives. That's a key value, a key belief, understanding, and knowledge that we need to absorb and take on board. So fourthly, not all risk is bad. You'll have heard Deborah mention the word opportunity a couple of times. If we think about risk being uncertainty that matters because it could impact our objectives, the question is, what kind of impact matters? Uncertainties that could hurt us certainly matter. But what about uncertainties that could help us? Here, this little picture of the mouse and the mousetrap and the cheese. This mouse is a good risk manager because he's got his little helmet on. He's spotted the uncertainty that he could be killed or injured as he tries to get the cheese. But that's not the only uncertainty that the mouse is exposed to. The mouse spotted an opportunity, the opportunity to get the cheese off the trap. And what the mouse has to do is manage two types of uncertainty at the same time. He has to get the cheese off the trap, which he might not be able to do. And he also has to do that whilst at the same time not triggering the trap, not being killed or injured. Risk includes both bad uncertainties and good uncertainties, uncertainties that could hurt us and uncertainties that could help us. So what we need to do is identify both threats and opportunities. A threat is an uncertainty that matters. It might never happen, but if it does happen, it will prevent us from achieving our objectives or make it harder. An opportunity is also an uncertainty that matters. It may never happen, but if it does happen, it helps us save time, save money, enhance reputation, enhance performance, do more with less, work faster, smarter, cheaper. These are all uncertainties that could help us achieve our goals. So risk management has two goals. It's about minimizing threats and maximizing opportunities in order to optimize achievement of objectives, prevent potential problems, and capture potential benefits. Now, this is a value. This is a belief. Some people believe that all risk is always bad. There's no such thing as a good risk. But that's not true when we understand that risk matters because it can affect our objectives. So it's a key value which affects our behavior and affects the risks that we understand and try to manage. The fifth of the values in the risk mindset is to understand that my risk is my responsibility. And if we ask the question, well, who's going to manage risks? Most of us say, well, not me. Somebody else can deal with it. Thank you. It's not for me to do. I'm far too busy with my day job. I don't have time to worry about things that might never happen. But actually, if we understand what risk is really about, we should recognize that if my objectives are affected by uncertainty, then it's my risk. My objectives are the things I've got to achieve. If there's an uncertainty that could affect my ability to achieve my objectives, then it's an uncertainty that matters to me. And if it's my risk and my responsibility, I need to deal with it. I need to take responsibility for the risks that can affect my objectives. So the answer to the question, who's going to manage risk, is, well, it depends who owns the objective that will be affected. If it's my objective, it's my risk, and then it's my responsibility. This is a value. This is a belief that we need to agree on and that we need to act out in practice. If we don't believe this, it will affect our behavior. And the last thing is something, again, that Deborah mentioned. It's really important to be proactive, to be looking to the future, to monitor the future. I see risk management as a forward-looking radar that scans the future, says what's out there that's coming this way. Some of those things are good and some of those things are bad. Some of those things are big and some of them are small. Some of them are moving quickly and some of them are moving slowly. So risk management scans the future and offers us an early warning system. Look out for that one. That's really bad. It's moving towards you fast and it could really hurt you. We need to avoid it, protect ourselves, move out of the way, do something. Look over here. Here's a big opportunity that could really help us. It's moving slowly towards us. Can we do something to move into its path and make sure that we can exploit it and capture it? So being proactive is really important, not reacting to things when it's too late, when the thing has just happened in front of us. That's what crisis management is for. That's what disaster recovery is for. That's what issue and problem management is for. But risk management is about managing the future before it happens through this early warning system. So these are the 6 values of the risk mindset. Risk is natural, risk is manageable, risk matters, it's important. Not all risk is bad. There are good risks as well as bad ones. If it affects my objectives, it's my responsibility to deal with, and I need to be proactive. So to assess risk culture, we can use these beliefs, these values, and test them. We can say, well, what do we think about whether risk is something we should expect or something abnormal? What do we think about whether we're victims of the things, the uncertainties that happen to us, or whether we can actually do something about it? What do we think about whether risk is really important or whether it's somebody else's problem? What do we think about whether some risks might be worth pursuing and exploiting and embracing and capturing? What do we think about the idea that each one of us should be responsible for managing our own risks in our own area? And that we really need to do this in advance, being proactive, creating management space to think about it before it happens. Each of these things are values that we can test, and we can see what the effect might be on the behavior and the culture of our organization, of our school. And once we spot something which doesn't look right, something which isn't in line with these natural thought values of the risk mindset, we can decide how to improve them and develop them. And I'll come to that in just a moment. So we can use the risk mindset with these 6 simple value statements that have a positive and a negative. You either believe it or you don't. You either think it's true or you don't think it's true. We can assess each one of those for our school or for our organization and decide, is it right? Are we in line with this? And if not, what are we going to do about it? So adopting the risk mindset simply means accepting that risk is natural. It's part of the world we live in. We can't help it. We can't avoid it. It's part of our setup and our context from being human in a world of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. Risk is manageable, so we should always seek to manage it. We should say whatever that risk is, whether it's good or bad, whether it's big or small, whether it's moving fast or slow, there's always something we can do, and we should. We should recognize that risk matters because it affects our objectives. So always focusing on what we're trying to achieve first. And that's why risk management is really important. Recognizing that there are both opportunities and threats out there, and then looking for them, looking out for the good things and the bad things, prioritizing them to find the best opportunities and the worst threats, and doing something about it. Taking responsibility for our own risks and doing it proactively. So we take action now in the present to change the future before it arrives. Adopting the risk mindset is quite simply taking these things and putting them into practice. Now, you could do this. This is really simple. You could take these 6 basic value statements and look at your school, look at your board, look at your senior leadership team, look into your departments and your groups and say, what do we think? Do we believe these things are true or do we not? And depending on what we believe, how is that affecting our behavior? Which leads us to the question, if we find something that needs to be improved, how are we going to do that? How can we improve risk culture? Well, I'd like to suggest to you a very simple structure. You'll find this mentioned in that Institute of Risk Management resources document, the big thick one. And this is something that I developed in 2011 and then offered to the IRM for this report. To understand how to change culture, we need to know where it comes from. And I have a model which I call the ABC model. C obviously stands for culture. But where does culture come from? Culture comes from repeated behavior. If you do something over and over and over and over again, it forms our culture. But where does behavior come from? Behavior comes from our attitudes, what we think. The way we think shapes what we do, and when we do it over and over again, it forms our culture. But culture is a context, and culture influences both what we think and what we do. So we end up with a kind of circle here, which could either be a virtuous circle, if we have a good attitude which shapes positive behavior, which leads to a mature culture, that will reinforce itself. Or we could have a vicious circle where we have bad attitudes which are not appropriate, which lead to bad behavior, which doesn't help us, which leads to a weak culture, which in turn reinforces bad thinking and behavior. So these things are quite straightforward. Who we are is formed by what we do. What we do is shaped by how we think. And then both what we do and how we think are influenced by who we are, creating these cycles of either vicious or virtuous. So that's where risk comes from, where culture comes from. And this will be an important framework as we decide how we can develop culture. So that's a standard culture model, the ABC model. If we look for an ABC model for risk, we just simply replace these generic blocks with risk-related blocks. So risk culture comes from how we behave towards risk, which in turn is shaped by what we believe about risk. And then we have these cycles in the same way. Now, I defined these definitions for the IRM thought leadership report in 2012, and Deborah's already quoted these, so I won't go into them in detail, but she told us, and this is what it says, risk attitude is a position we choose in relation to risk, influenced by what we think the risk is. So individuals or groups can have an attitude towards risk, which says, well, risk is good, risk is bad, I'm going to be risk averse or risk seeking or risk neutral, and it depends on how we see the risk. Risk behavior are the things we can see, decision making, processes, communications, reporting, workshops, all these things are behavior. And then culture is values, beliefs, knowledge and understanding about risk. So we've got our definitions. The question is, how do we improve the culture? A lot of people try to just modify behavior. Behavior modification is where we generally start. Why don't we just enforce some workshops? Why don't we insist that everybody fills out the risk register? Why don't we have risk reviews every month or every quarter? Why don't we put risk management on the agenda of every board meeting? That will do it. That'll change our culture. But that's just changing behavior. Behavior is influenced by what we think and about who we are, our culture. What we need to do is not just change the thing that's out there externally. We need to make sure we have lasting change, which won't just come from behavior modification. Now, the ABC model tells us that behavior and culture come from risk attitudes. How we think determines what we do. What we do shapes who we become, and who we are has that feedback to create the loop. I'd like to suggest to you that to improve culture, we need to do things differently, but to do things differently, we need to think differently. If we could change our risk attitude, then it would make us behave differently towards risk, which would shape a different culture. So how do we change risk attitude? How do you change the way somebody thinks about risk? It is possible, and I'd like to suggest to you a very simple way to do it. The way we think about risk exists on a spectrum. We call this the risk attitude spectrum. When you're faced with an uncertainty, there's a range of different positions you could adopt. Some people are very uncomfortable in the presence of uncertainty. They're below the line. Some people are very positive in their response to uncertainty. They're above the line. They have a positive response when something is uncertain. Now, this is a continuous distribution. Different people will be in different places. What we tend to do, because it's hard to kind of map on a continuous distribution, is we divide the risk attitude spectrum into zones. So we would talk about people who don't like uncertainty. They either don't like it a little bit, like, oh, I'm not sure about this, or I hate this. That's what we call risk averse. There are some people who quite enjoy risk, either a little bit or a lot. They say, oh, that's good. My job is risky. I like risk. I can roll my sleeves up and show what I can do. Oh, risk is fabulous. I wish I had more risk in my job. These are risk-seeking people. And then we have people who go, yeah, well, risk is normal. We call these risk tolerant. It's not a big deal. It doesn't really affect things. It's just part of the life. So the risk attitude spectrum represents a range of different positions that we can adopt in response to a given uncertainty. Now, you've looked at this for a minute or two. Let me ask you a question. Where are you on the risk attitude spectrum? And if you think for a moment, you'll realize that actually it depends. It depends on what I'm doing. It depends on the situation in which I have to identify and manage and take risks. For example, Deborah mentioned zip lining in Colorado. As it happens, yesterday I did the world's longest zip line here in South Africa. It's 3.2 kilometers, it's 2 miles long. And I got to a speed going headfirst down this mountain at just over 70 miles an hour, 114 kilometers an hour. I was taking risks. I was having a great time. I launched myself headfirst off the top of a mountain and went down shouting and screaming, and it was fabulous. If you ask me about how my attitude is towards, let's say, bringing up my children, or investing for my pension, or thinking about my reputation as an expert, actually, I'm a little bit more risk averse. Where I am on the risk attitude spectrum depends on the situation. And the same is true for you. So how about if we ask the question, well, where should you be? Where is the right place on the risk attitude spectrum for a member of a school board, or a head teacher, or a member of staff, or any other member of the organization? And again, it depends. It depends on what you're trying to do. If you're trying to deal with a safeguarding issue, you should be risk averse. If you're trying to develop a new offering to the market, you might want to be a bit more risk seeking. So what we discover from this is that risk attitude is variable. It depends on the situation. You are not always risk averse. You could be risk averse in one situation and risk seeking in another. And if it's variable, you could choose a different risk attitude. You could say, well, sometimes I'm risk seeking, sometimes I'm risk averse. What should I be? And then manage that risk attitude to be in a different place. We have a kind of comfort zone, a preference. This is where we generally settle. But actually, we could manage risk attitude proactively and intentionally to change it. Well, how could we do that? How could we change risk attitude? I'd like to suggest to you a very simple framework which has 7 words that start with A. And I developed this and I've written about this, worked it out in practice with risk psychologists and in practice with real organizations. This is simple. This is something you can do. I'll just summarize it here because of time, but I can share links with more details if you're interested. So the 7 A's framework starts with awareness and appreciation. What's going on and why? What is my current risk attitude and where did it come from? And why is this happening? And how does it affect my behavior towards risk and ultimately our organizational risk culture? Awareness and appreciation, what's going on and why? And once we have awareness and appreciation, the next question is this okay? So the third A is assessment. Is my risk attitude, the current place where I sit on that spectrum, appropriate? Is it helping me achieve my goals or is it preventing me achieve my goals? Are we actually in a position which is unhelpful and we need to do something? Or actually, is it okay? We can just carry on. And based on what we assess, we could think, well, actually, our risk attitude and our behavior and our culture are fine. We don't need to do anything. So we have another A, which is let's accept it. Let's just carry on as we are with our set of beliefs, with our set of behaviors and the culture that we have. But it might be that actually the way we are in our organization is not appropriate. It's not helping us to achieve our goals. We have some inappropriate values and beliefs about risk which need to change. In which case, we have 2 more A's: assertion, we need to do something, and action, doing something. Now, each of these A's has tools and techniques and assessments and things, details behind them you'll understand. But as a framework, you could do this. What's going on and why with our board or with our senior leadership team or with our department leaders? What are we thinking about risk? And is it okay or not? And should we do something or can we carry on? Now, I said this is the 7 A's framework. So we've got awareness, appreciation, assessment, either acceptance or assertion and action. We're missing something. What do you think the 7th A is? I don't hear you shouting. You'll have to shout louder. The 7th A is appraisal. Is it still okay? It's really important that having either decided to carry on as we are or decided that we need to change, we have a look and see, well, now we're doing something different or we're not doing something different. Is it still okay? And do we now need to make a change? So we have an ongoing living process that says, let's understand where we are, decide if it's okay, change it or don't change it, and then come back and look later and say, so now where are we? And this simple framework allows you to understand your current risk attitude, the current risk attitude of your organization, of your school, of your board, and change it proactively, intentionally, in order to get something which is more appropriate. So I want to just leave it at that because of time and make sure that we have some opportunities for questions. So let me wrap up with just a few final thoughts and summarize what we've covered so far. I hope you can see how these general principles and general ideas can apply to you in your organization. And if not, let's raise those ideas in the questions. So risk culture matters because beliefs affect behavior. Here's a set of paired beliefs that you might believe. You might believe that risk is avoidable. We should have a school that has no risks in it at all. We don't have to have risk. Risk is no risk, please, we're British, we used to say, or that risk is natural and it's part of the environment. How you believe will affect your behavior. You might think that risk is a bad thing or risk is a good thing, or both. You might think if we have a high risk activity, that means it's really dangerous, we need to avoid it or protect ourselves. Or you might think high risk is really exciting. You think risk should be prevented or exploited. You'll see these are pairs of beliefs. And where you are on these pairs of beliefs will affect your behavior, and in turn, your behavior will shape your culture. So it's really important. But there's another reason why risk culture matters. In the IRM document that we've been quoting from, it says this: the prevailing risk culture within an organization can make it significantly better or worse at managing risk. As we said right at the very beginning, risk culture is a CSF. It's either a critical success factor, a good, strong, mature risk culture will make you better at managing risk, Or it's a CSF because it's a critical source of failure. A weak or poor or inappropriate risk culture can make you worse at managing risk. It really matters, because if you can't manage your risks effectively, you won't be able to achieve your objectives effectively. So it really matters because it influences the culture, influences how we think and how we behave. That culture affects our risk appetite, which means we could be taking too much risk or too little risk, and sets up these virtuous or vicious circles, which reinforce themselves within our organization. So risk culture is really important. We can assess it using the risk mindset, these 6 basic core beliefs or values, which we can assess in our school, in our organization. What do we really believe about risk? Once we've assessed it, we can decide, is this appropriate or not? And then change if we need to, using something simple like the 7A's framework to change how we think and how we believe about risk, and end up with a more mature risk culture so that we can take the right risks safely and succeed in achieving our goals. Well, I hope you found that useful and interesting and stimulating and provoking, and something that you could take away and apply. I recognize we've gone fairly quickly through this subject, and there may well be things that you'd like to talk more about. My contact details are here. My slides have been sent in, so you'll get copies of those through ISCA afterwards. But I'm very happy to address questions now, and I'll pass this back to Amy to handle the questions. But thank you very much for your attention. I hope you found that helpful.